Hello and welcome to the Business of Betting podcast. Today I'm joined by Rob Waterhouse. Rob, thank you very much for joining me. Before we get into this episode, make sure you follow us on Twitter @BettingPod and check out the website businessofbetting.com. Guest suggestions are much appreciated. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Betfair Proprietary Limited. Betfair operates a betting exchange and is licensed in the Northern Territory of Australia. Residents of Australia can join Betfair by visiting betfair.com.au and support this podcast by using promo code BOBPOD. Please gamble responsibly. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy this episode of the Business of Betting podcast. Today I'm joined by Rob Waterhouse. Rob, thank you very much for joining me.
A great pleasure.
So Rob, what was your first memory in racing and wagering that you can recall?
Well, my father was a bookmaker. I wasn't allowed to go to the races till I was 16, but I used to go up with Dad every Saturday morning to the office at 8 o'clock in the morning and work with him there. And I'd come, when he came home at night, at 6 o'clock at night from the races, I'd go to the office and meet him there and help him with the settling and other chores. So that was my first involvement in racing. And of course, sitting around the kitchen table and being with him a lot, it's amazing how much you actually understand about racing and betting. Thinking everyone else understands it, but it's just a huge advantage growing up in a betting family, I suppose.
So do you feel like there's a big part of it is osmosis and just being exposed to a lot of it from a young age and I guess all the time?
Absolutely. I think that's really important in all businesses. You know, a person whose family grows up in a business, a person who grows with a family with a business, they understand the business much better than other people right from the start.
So what drives you every day? It sounds like, and I don't know you at all, but it sounds like from everything you can read and hear, you're a very diligent form student. Is that fair to say?
Well, I suppose it is. I suppose I'd like to think I've always had a good work ethic, and unfortunately you can't make a success of betting on horses unless you've done the work beforehand. So
how are you able to do it year after year, decade after decade? Is there a secret sauce to it all?
I think it's just getting yourself into a habit of doing it on the one hand. But secondly, I think it's probably a bit easier now than it's been because there are less people doing the form effectively than there once were. What do you mean by that? You just think that people have been taken away to sports betting or other things? Well, I suppose so. We don't see them, I guess. But I remember saying to a reporter in the 70s or early 80s, there were perhaps 400 people at the races on a Wednesday who'd spend a lot of time doing the form and didn't lose at the end of the year. Now, there might be tomorrow at Canterbury, one or two people have spent a lot of time on the form and don't lose at the end of the year. There's been a big change in the skill set of at least the people who go to the races. On the other hand, you have the big punting monoliths that do the form better than anyone else has done in the past, and they're very successful, but we don't see those as such. Okay. We can dig into some of that later. I want to just ask you generally, without giving away any proprietary secrets or anything like that, but what does doing the form mean to you? What is that? What type of process do you undertake? Well, I suppose I'd describe what I do as being virtually the same as I used to do 40 years ago. The same sort of skills are needed and the same processes. I keep 3 handicaps, a weight handicap, a la Phil Bull or Don Scott, then a time handicap, a la Phil Bull when he used to do his time ratings, and I keep a pace handicap, which is perhaps a bit different for other people, but I suspect that we get the same sort of results with the pace handicap. So have either of those or any of those 3 factors developed or changed much? I know, people look at times and people evaluate pace, but weight seems to be shifting over the last sort of decade or two. How have you felt they've evolved, or are they pretty steady all the way along? I guess that's a good question. In the case of weight, I think people pay less attention to weight than they perhaps should. And of course, punters lose less backing horses with lots of weight than they do backing horses with no weight in races, which means it's not taken into account fully. So, look, I'm sure that weight ratings are still very important. I think they're the most important factor.
And do you go through each horse individually and evaluate all the other different factors that go into it, or do you have a sort of a process and a systematic evaluation of different inputs that ultimately spit out an assessment or a price?
No, my job is to try and assess what price each horse should be, and I spend time looking at each horse and working out where it fits in the race and what represents its chance.
And have you always done it that way, giving each horse essentially a percentage chance or an assessed price?
Yes, the same as my father always did.
And have you seen other people do it different ways and win long term, or is that one of the sort of key ways to do it?
Well, I had a friend and a punter who was very successful, and we all used to markets to bet off, and he took a very straightforward approach. He marked his top pick a 2 to 11 chance, in other words, an 85% chance of winning. And I must say, he won lots of money over the period. So I don't say it's the only way of doing it, but he just used back his top pick all the time and treated it as an 85% chance of winning, which seems strange, but it most certainly works for him. $1.22 chance.
And what about the bookmaking side versus the betting side? Do you do anything differently at all in terms of preparation?
I see them as being very much the same. I sort of find bookmaking slightly easier than punting, I suppose, because you've got the slight natural percentage on your side, and I can pick out horses I don't like at all and make sure I lay all those. So I actually prefer the bookmaking side, but punting is very similar.
And one thing that's sort of interesting to me is this idea that you fluctuate in how good you can do the form. Do you sense that you can have periods of time or ebbs and flows where you pick up things you otherwise wouldn't, or vice versa, and you miss things that you might normally factor in?
Well, often you can be successful and put it down to your own brilliance, but it's just a question of luck falling your way. And conversely, you have times where you do the form very well, but luck goes against you. I worked at the Darwin Cup meeting yesterday and spent a lot of time doing the Darwin Cup's a meeting in the outback of Australia, and they race on a dirt surface with sump oil in it. Anyway, the first 4 races I did brilliantly, I suppose. In the last 5, I didn't do quite as good a job. But it's just the luck of things, isn't it, rather than not doing a good job so much.
Sure. No, that makes sense. So what type of review process do you go through? Do you treat review as seriously as you do the preparation side, or is it get the preparation and form right and the rest will take care of itself?
Well, no, I most certainly look at it after every meeting. I spend an hour looking at if I can find a reason I made a mistake in the way I've done the form, and I spend a lot of time reanalyzing previous races after the results come in and adjusting, and I think that's a very important process.
So will you reprice the runners after a race to basically put them in a position they should have been rather than what you had them prior to the race?
Well, it's now done by the computer, but I say if that race will run tomorrow, what would the betting now be?
Yep.
And I also keep video comments to where there might be excuses for horses. A horse should be more highly regarded than the computer spits out.
And do you find that you have certain tendencies that you try and avoid or even elevate if they're positive? You might find certain horses in certain situations or certain things you see or pick out that you notice over time?
I'm not sure what you're really saying. I suppose I do look for certain characteristics. Are you saying I try and avoid them? What are you saying, Jake?
More so, favorites between $2 and $3 in 26 or longer races? Perhaps you find that you do a pretty good job in that section, or there's other things. First up horses over 1,000 meters at Canterbury. For some reason, you find you have a good handle on pricing them well.
I sort of think I do a good job with all of them, and 1,000-meter races, I treat them totally differently, and I think time's far more important, and I'm sure that's right. I use my time ratings almost exclusively in 1,000-meter races, whereas in a mile-and-a-half or 2-mile races, the weight ratings are totally important. But I'd like to think I've had the experience to change them from the mistakes I've made in the past to try and get it somewhere near right. And I suppose that the bane of every form student's life is the resuming horse. It's hard to mark those correctly. It's a very hard task, and it's hard to take positions with them.
And you mentioned before video comments. Have you constantly have to evaluate things like going back and reviewing the video? And obviously when you started, there probably wasn't access to certain things there are today. Have you adopted things early, or have you taken time to see their value before doing it?
I sound like a very old person. It was a 14-year-old. I remember my father buying in 1968 a video recorder, an extraordinary expense to help record the races and for the video comments. And I've employed one of my people who works for me. His entire job is looking at watching the videos and making the video comments. I don't enjoy it very much, actually, and I'd rather he did than I do it. But still, it's an important thing. It's hard to make any money out of video comments, I suppose. The only thing I'd say, because everyone sees them, but you've got to be aware of them. Otherwise, it can be costly. But it's hard to actually to say, yes, I backed that winner because of that video comment.
So how do you allocate your time then? Do you have a strict, rigid process where you spend a lot of time doing certain things, or does it just depend?
Well, I spend a lot of time doing it. I suppose my important job is I check the time ratings and the weight ratings for each race being after the races. I then go back and look at the collateral form, how it's developed, and readjust the class ratings on that. And then I start on the next day's racing program and try and do as good a market as I can.
So in your experience, how repeatable do you think being a very good form student is? Do you think it just takes 10,000 hours or 10,000 races or whatever it might be to get there, or do you think there's a natural instinct to it and there's a knack of being able to pick up things that others probably cannot?
Look, I do think that the Gladwell's 10,000 hours is important. And I think the second thing is you only really learn things through your pocket by actually making mistakes and being cranky about it. There are people that have spent a lot more than 10,000 hours doing horse form or other things and don't learn much, because unless you actually are punished when you make a mistake, you keep making the same mistakes. And I've got lots of scars from mistakes I've made, and hopefully learned a lot.
So tell me about bankroll allocation then, and maybe on the betting side, what type of things do you value most when, obviously the form assessment, going through the details, pricing up a race is one element, then you've got how to allocate your bankroll. Take us through your sort of mindset when it comes to that.
Well, look, everyone's a great fan of the Kelly criterion, and Don Scott, who worked with me and my father in the late 60s, early 70s, I think his greatest contribution was actually his staking plan, which is matching the outlays of the percent of the horse. And look, I think that's very important to make sure that you are betting with a plan in mind. It's very easy to be lulled into having too much on short-priced horses and not enough on long-priced horses. So, look, I think staking is very important. The trouble in racing is that betting as the pools, or betting as a bookmaker, or betting as a punter, you can't bet as big as you'd like to bet. So it's you have to sort of match up with what the market will bear. Otherwise, you're betting too big, and you have to take shorter odds.
So you mentioned having a plan in place. Will you deviate from that plan or be flexible race by race, or are you sticking to that plan?
You have to be flexible, but I will say in a perfect world, I should be having X dollars on this horse. Will the market bear it? How can I do it? And I'll trim my sails in accordance with what's achievable.
So you've almost got to predict how the market will play out, I guess, and think about how you think, this $4 second favourite will either drift or firm and so on and so forth. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think it is, and there's a fair bit of game theory involved. In other words, how to achieve the price you want to achieve. You got to think how the market will react to the situation, and it is almost like game theory in lots of occasions, betting on course as a bookmaker or as a punter.
So how did you think about that? And I guess if you're standing up on the stand and you're seeing different people come and bet with you, that's information in and of itself, of course. And then these days you've got Betfair, or you can see, different odds comparison sites. How did you sort of digest all that information and prioritize it? Was it just gut feeling?
For me as a bookmaker, one of the problems is I don't want to put my assessment on my board. I want to try and lay the horses I don't like at as short a price as I can. And it is a bit of a game to try and not expose my hand, but still end up with the bet to the book I want to be there.
And were you comfortable having large swings depending on horses who are going to win, rather than just having a nice balanced book?
Look, I've never had the benefit of a nice balanced book, and I've always, as my father did, I've always taken strong positions.
And do you think that's obviously is? How easy is it to make that sustainable long term? Can you, with the inherent edge, is it sustainable long term for just the general bookmaker, or does it take a specific skill set to be able to pull that off week after week?
Well, the one thing I know is the bookmaker that actually has to make balanced books destroys his profit margin and earns very little from his business. That just doesn't work, unfortunately. The bookmaker that makes a balanced book, he gets nowhere fast.
So do you prefer, it sounds like you prefer bookmaking, is that fair to say, as opposed to the betting?
I think that's right.
You can get a lot out of it anyway?
Yes, that's true. I must say that I actually, my turnover figures are actually higher in punting than they are in bookmaking, but I prefer the bookmaking.
And on the betting side, did you like the idea of being able to pick your spots and not having to put up a board every race? Or what are some of the things from the betting side that you preferred? Well,
look, I'm involved with betting on the totes with the exotics, and I suppose it's a bit like putting up the board on every race, insofar as we back many combinations in every race everywhere. So it is a bit the same as putting up the board in every race. So that doesn't worry me. I remember Don Scott saying 40-odd years ago that you can't predict where the next good winner is going to come from. You've just got to keep playing the game as it is and hoping the chips fall the right way.
Let's talk price. Unlike bookies and toads, the Betfair exchange is a low-margin, buy-sell, fixed-odds marketplace where the value stays with the punter, not the house. Ready for the game within the game? Join betfair.com.au. Gamble responsibly.
So take us through the execution side, and I guess the art of betting well, or however you want to phrase it. Did you ever find that difficult? And I guess, you do the form, you're prepared, you've got your price, and then you've got to decide then how you execute on that. Is that a skill in and of itself that you can sort of develop, or how did you find that side of it?
Well, from bookmaking-wise, and I suppose punting-wise, you've got to be very aware of the market, and it's no good saying, I want to lay this horse straight away and reaching for it, because you'll end up laying it at a very long price and destroy any margin you might have in your favour. There is quite a bit of game theory involved with it. It sounds a bit flippant to say it, but it's very important. And the same with punting. You've got to wait until the market settles down, and you've got to sense which way the market's going, and you've got to take advantage of it.
How hard is it to be good enough to succeed at both the form assessment and the art of betting? Have you seen a lot of great form students fall away just because they weren't able to manage their bank, and vice versa? They might have been great at betting, but they just couldn't pick the right horses at the right times?
I have two good friends, and both are fortunate enough to be given access to the form assessments of the biggest punting group in Australia. And one of them proudly boasts that he hasn't drawn his wages for years because he wins so much money punting and he has a wonderful life. His best friend, a very keen punter, loses money month in, month out, backing on the same tips. And it's simply because he has too much on the short-priced horses and doesn't manage his money properly and takes the wrong odds things. It's quite amazing the difference between the two people with the same tip. So it's obviously very important.
So take us through how you deal with bad runs or losing runs or just poor results over any period of time. Do you have a process in place to be able to cope with those?
Well, there's no doubt that when a gambler has a run against him, you have to firstly trim your sails a bit smaller, number one. And number two, you have to go back to basics and just make sure that everything you're doing is very solid. And that's what I do. I go back to basics.
Will you take time away? Will you dig into the sort of details into what you're doing and try and assess why? And if it's just, this horse is losing by a nose more times than in the past? Or do you sort of sit back and think about what are the core principles and go back to those?
I'm just into what the core principles are. I recognise you're going to have winning runs and losing runs. It's just back to basics.
So what are some of the important lessons that you've picked up along the way and over your time, whether it be at the track or just in general being in this industry?
Well, I suppose the one lesson I keep quoting, I remember it as a young 16-year-old clerk at the races. There was a man, I'm sure he's long dead, called Lenny Shapiro, who used to come every race day and bet with my Uncle Jack, who was a leading bookmaker. And he'd back the first favourite, wherever it was, to win $50, which was a lot of money in those days. And if it got beaten, he'd then back the next favourite, wherever it was racing, to win what he'd lost on the first plus the $50, and then the third favourite was. And every day it seemed to me that he would win his $50 and he'd go and collect it for my uncle. And he said, "I'm taking a beautiful young girl out for lunch now." And I thought, well, this is absolutely marvellous. But I must say, within a year, he lost $300,000 to my uncle, which is a lot of money in those early 1970s. And I remember thinking to myself, well, the martingale punters do run into big trouble at times. So the moral of the story is you must never chase your losses and bet up bigger when you're winning and smaller when you're losing. I think that's
You must have seen millions of different approaches and strategies, whether it be martingale or otherwise, over your time.
Yes, but I think that's a very important lesson that I learnt, and I was strict by it for the first, quite a few months, thinking what a smart man he was. But of course, it was a huge mistake and a great lesson to me.
A lot of people answer this differently, but are there many different ways to win in your mind? And I guess we just spoke a little bit about betting strategies, but are there some things that you just cannot avoid if you're going to win long term with this game?
Well, obviously, it's value and staking plans. You can't win unless you have the value in your favour, and you must stake your money appropriately. And when you have something in your favour, you must bet a bit bigger, and you must be sure. I sort of like the old poker comment that if you're not sure who the mug is in the card game, it's obviously you. I like to understand why I've mark a horse at a shorter price than other people, or indeed a longer price than other people. I think understanding why there's a difference is probably an important thing.
Why do you continue being involved in this industry for so long? You mentioned you've been up to Darwin. For those who haven't been there, it's a quite a hot place from time to time, and there is a good carnival up there. But just tell us why you are so passionate and still to this day.
Well, I really enjoy the Darwin Carnival. There's lots of money there. I actually enjoy the challenge of doing the Darwin form, and I normally do a pretty reasonable job. I find the challenge. I really enjoy it.
If you had a choice, and it was, the industry was carved out in a way that you wanted it, would you be on the rails Wednesday and Saturday at Randwick or Rose Hill or wherever it might be, or do you prefer the big Melbourne carnivals, or do you like travelling around the country and around the world even? I know you've been in New Zealand and Royal Ascot and a few other places.
Uniquely, I'm lucky enough to I've made a book at the Royal Ascot in England and the English Derby and so forth. I'm the only bookmaker in the last 100 years that's actually been able to work in New Zealand, and I hold licenses in New South Wales and Victoria and Tasmania and South Australia and the Northern Territory and Queensland. And I must say, I enjoy going to the various carnivals. I love the Melbourne Spring Carnival. I think it's absolutely fantastic. Of course, Sydney's my home. And I love the Warrnambool meeting, the jumps meeting. I really love doing the jumps form. I like it all.
And have you found many similarities across the different jurisdictions and a lot of, the same themes coming up, whether it's on the bookmaking betting side or just the industry in general, or do you think they're all very different and unique and carry their own traditions and other things that make them special?
Well, I think if you had the same field, I'll start again. If the Sydney Ring and the Sydney punters were betting on the Melbourne races, I think the market would be a bit different to what is in Melbourne, and vice versa. I think if they were in the Melbourne bookmakers and punters were betting on the Sydney races, I think the market would be a bit different to what it is in Sydney. So it is a little bit of a different approach. And, it's interesting, but I sort of think that Sydney might be a bit, the Sydney market might be a bit more accurate than perhaps is in Melbourne. But perhaps Melbourne people wouldn't like my saying that. But I think the Sydney market is very well chewed over. And perhaps Sydney doesn't have the same depth as, in fairness, Melbourne has lots of depth to very strong country areas.
Yeah, so one example of that is a lot of English horses or Irish horses came over for the Melbourne Cup, and they would bring 2 or 3 or 4 over, probably be $6-7 favourites. Some would go out hard in the lead and they wouldn't be able to hold on, and then they would go back to the UK and just say, that wasn't for us. And all the Aussies would say, well, they just got it wrong. They don't understand how racing is here. You can't sit 3 and 4 wide from the 1,000. Why is it, do you think, it's just not compatible necessarily across jurisdictions? Are you able to sort of articulate any points that might be able to sort of describe what's happening?
Well, if you compare the last, say, 600 metres in a race with the overall time, for all races in England and all races in Australia and all races in America, in England they go much, much slower earlier than we do here. And in America, they go much, much faster than we do here. I'd like to think that we run quite even sectionals, and I'd like to think that we're actually right. But and look, we've had quite a few Australian jockeys go to England and ride more of the Australian style with great success. So, look, I'd like to think that we actually have got the tactics right, but no doubt English people would disagree with me.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Rob, and same with cricket and probably every other sport. So,
a man called Zatopek in the early 50s revolutionised foot running by running even sectionals, and we do close to that with horse racing in Australia. But the English would not agree with me.
So, what are some of the best horses that you've ever seen or ever placed a wager on?
Well, of course, I suffer the same fault everyone else does. Seeing great horses with young eyes puts them, you elevate them very highly, and I've never seen a horse like Kingston Town or Luscombe Star. But I suppose if I stand back and say, well, is that sensible? I suspect that the modern-day champion Winks and Black Caviar are better horses. There's a thing in horse racing is a bit like IQs, and there's a theory, if that's the right word, that IQs every year to achieve this 100, which is the average IQ, you've got to be a tiny bit smarter. And I'm sure that applies to horse racing. The actual standard population has improved gradually over the years. And they're better fed and perhaps better trained and whatever else. So I'm sure that the standard is high, and I can't see why Winks and Black Caviar aren't the best we've ever had in Australia.
So how do you share ideas or get information from others to develop your thoughts and processes? Do you have any special tips for those out there, or is it just a matter of, embracing the day-to-day and listening, basically?
Well, unfortunately, the horse races used to be a place where there'd be lots of chatting and banter and what else, but the people have disappeared from the races, and there's not much to be learnt through the media. There are quite a few good books and that people can read, but there's not really a lot of, apart from that, there's not really a lot to be learnt. You've got to talk to people. It's hard to find people that don't understand racing.
So your website, you've been writing lately on there. What drives you to write on there, and what type of articles are you going to keep putting up for those who haven't read them already?
Well, it's just I don't put much up. I just make a little few comments about the things people were talking about at the meeting I was at the previous day, and I'm told I'm a little bit critical of various things, but I think it's more that the general media is very uncritical of anything. Everything's sugar coated, and of course I think it's unfortunate that's the case. I think it's good to have a little bit of criticism. Otherwise, you get no improvement.
No, absolutely. And one last question for you, Rob, before I let you go, and I very much appreciate you coming on. 16-year-old Rob Waterhouse, or any other young punter out there who's a horse racing fan who wants to get involved, do you have any advice that you can pass along based on the time you've spent in this game?
Well, of course, you've got to become an apprentice to somebody, haven't you? That's the best advice to give. You can't do it on your own. It's hard to do it on your own. You've got to actually become an apprentice to somebody. And I was lucky enough with my father. Not only did my father have a great idea, but he worked with a man called Barry Terry, who was very brilliant, and Arthur Harris, and a man called John Munro. And they were very brilliant and clever people. And I learned lots from them, and I also learned from a man called Harry Broadley, who was a very brilliant bookmaker and a good form student. You learn from people. It's hard to find those people. I think the advice is you've got to become an apprentice to somebody.
Okay, great advice. No, I do appreciate your time, Rob, and thanks for coming on the podcast to have a chat.